Hey guys, Coach Pop. Thanks for joining me for this week's video lecture. Today we're looking at Strayer's Chapter 13, Political Transformations, Empires, and Encounters, 1450 to 1750. And as you may recall, in the introduction to the unit, Strayer is definitely in the camp of labeling this period the early modern period. And so he's going to emphasize the newness of this period. And among the most bold and newest things that happen are the development of European empires in the Americas, and so that's where he's going to focus most of his attention in this particular chapter. As part of this broader aim to show the novelty of early modern empires, Strayer begins by pointing out that the European empires were unique because they involved expansion into areas that were separated by vast expanses of ocean. Until now, empire building had been a process of conquering territory over a contiguous landmass. Indeed, this is a central difference between European empires and other empires of the period. It is worth remembering that Europeans also built their empires in parts of Asia as well as in the Americas. Strayer will look more closely at the European presence in Asia in the next chapter. So what made it possible for Western Europeans to do this? It's a rather complex question, but Strayer offers several answers. Europe had a decided advantage for access to the Americas as it was a short trip across the Atlantic, and the winds were steady and favorable, unlike the shifting monsoon winds of the Indian Ocean, for example. As we have seen, the European understanding of these wind patterns would serve them well. European weaknesses, such as being on the margins of the Afro-Eurasian trade networks, being relatively poor, and needing more land to feed the population recovering from the Black Death, all served as push factors to drive Europeans overseas and toward the Americas. Almost all social groups had some reason to favor expansion. Both the poor and the elites wanted to gain land and wealth. Merchants wanted markets and imports. The church wanted to spread the faith. Knights wanted glory. And everybody wanted gold and spices. The near constant rivalries among European states manifested itself in competition on the seas. These conflicts ensured that the states and trading companies had the organization to take on the project of overseas expansion. Europeans built upon technology gained from contact with the Muslim world to create an increasingly efficient fleet of ships and amass a superior arsenal of weaponry. Europeans also found local allies among the conquered peoples of the Aztecs and Inca who were eager to help them. These Native Americans who helped the Europeans, like Doña Marina in the portrait section of the chapter, have left a complex legacy in the minds of many people today. However, the greatest advantage the Europeans had was one they did not understand but carried with them wherever they went: a whole host of infectious diseases. Estimates are that the New World had a population of between 60 and 80 million people. As they had been isolated from the diseased but wealthy Old World for thousands of years, they had not developed immunities to both serious epidemic diseases and what were common endemic illness in Afro-Eurasia. Illnesses such as smallpox, measles, typhus, influenza, malaria, and yellow fever wreaked havoc in the Americas, exacting a terrible toll. In some places, 90% of the population died. Central Mexico went from a population of about 10 to 20 million people to 1 million in a mere 150 years. It was not until the late 17th century that the population began to recover, but even then only in a few places. This mass death opened up the continents for European conquerors and their African slaves. In this map of the European colonial empires, you can see the areas that are settled. Note in the area settled by the Spanish, it looks on this map that it's kind of three big chunks, but in their administration it was really two. In New Spain, it was administered from the Mexico City. In South America, that was one area that they called Peru that was administered from Lima. So the Columbian Exchange is the name we give for the dramatic impact of joining this new world with the old world to form what is truly a global system for the first time. The Europeans who came to the Americas not only brought themselves and their germs, but also their animals, both domesticated and not, pests such as rats, for example, and their plants, again, both domesticated and not so desirable plants like weeds. Horses and pigs played an important role in the post-Columbian development of the Americas. The two most important food crops to come from the Americas were corn, or maize, and potatoes. Corn became a common staple throughout the Old World, but especially in Africa. Potatoes likewise had their greatest impact in Europe, especially Ireland and Russia, but the sweet potato was also very popular in China. Indeed, American crops such as potatoes, corn, and later peanuts would eventually become 20% of China's agricultural produce by the early 20th century. As a truly global exchange network developed, people began to consume a variety of stimulants from around the world. Even as more and more people began consuming Chinese tea and Arab coffee, it was tobacco and chocolate from the Americas that made the biggest impact on global markets during this period. Global networks transported commodities such as silver from the Potosi mine in the Andes, human beings from Africa, and sugar from Brazil and later the Caribbean. These commodities affected societies and economies throughout the world, and their producers and transporters could become fabulously wealthy in the process. Europe was the biggest winner in the Columbian exchange, seen both in the wealth it extracted from the New World and in its own demographic growth. Thanks to the Columbian exchange, the previously poor and marginal Europe could enter into trade and competition with the historically more powerful and wealthy Asian societies. Given their distance from their European homeland and the unusual mixture of peoples from 4 different continents, it's not hard to understand why these American colonies developed new social structures. While each of these new societies reflected its own unique situation, we can nonetheless identify several similarities. The first similarity is that these societies were governed by a policy in which the main objective for European monarchies was to convert all wealth into gold or silver bullion. To achieve this aim, colonies were expected to provide valuable exports to the homeland, as well as served as closed markets for imports from the homeland. Another similarity is that in each of these societies, women were in a precarious position, given the enormous imbalance in the number of men and women. Despite the inequality of patriarchy, European women were expected to be the bearers of civilization in the New World. For Native American and African women, the situation was even more challenging. Throughout all of these societies, rape and sexual abuse was quite prevalent. Despite these similarities, there were great differences among these societies. Let's take a look at 3 of these societies, the first 2 in Latin America and the third in North America. Much of the territory conquered by the Spanish included lands controlled by the 2 largest empires in pre-Columbian America. Consequently, the Spanish colonies developed a slightly different socio-economic system than their fellow Catholics, the Portuguese, did in Brazil. As both the Aztecs and Inca had developed large-scale agriculture, the Spanish were able to build upon this base and feed itself as well as provide exports abroad. Once gold and silver deposits were discovered, including the world's largest silver mine in Potosi, mining became its largest industry. In order to control the land and labor, the Spanish instituted a series of colonial legal systems. In the encomienda system, Spanish settlers were given control over a community and allowed to extract wealth and labor as they saw fit. This system led to horrific abuses and was replaced by the repartimiento system, which was under more direct government supervision, but it was still quite abusive. Eventually, the government instituted the hacienda system, in which Spaniards built large estates and paid peons low wages to work their land. Because the Spanish were a very small minority in their colonies, and because there were very few Spanish women, the social hierarchy that developed was focused on the purity of blood. Pure-blooded Spanish were very concerned about their undiluted blood, but they also saw distinctions among themselves. Those born in the colonies were inferior to those from the Iberian Peninsula, yet both were superior to the mixed-race indigenous and African individuals. Spanish men jealously guarded their women from mixed-race marriages, and they were doing this to try to preserve the purity of their blood and to stop the tarnishing of their honor from the male perspective. Mixed race individuals, particularly the Spanish and Native American mixing, were divided into numerous groups or castas based on their percentage of Spanish, Indian, or in some few cases African blood. As there were very few Spanish women, most Spanish men took native wives to create a mestizo mix, which indicates, of course, an obvious gender double standard. While the indigenous population suffered from both the Great Dying and from the exploitative colonial regime, they remained the overwhelming majority for quite a while. Even so, they were at the bottom of the social hierarchy. Many indigenous women sought refuge in mixed or Spanish marriages to protect their children from colonial abuses. Despite the fact that they were Catholic and shared the Iberian Peninsula in Europe, the Portuguese colonial experience in the Americas was different from the Spanish. For one thing, Brazil had no civilizations with large-scale agriculture before European contact. Consequently, it developed an economic base centered almost exclusively on sugar production. After learning about sugar from the Arabs who were trading in the Mediterranean, the Portuguese pioneered sugar production in Brazil and enjoyed a century-long monopoly in the Americas until later the British, Dutch, and French got involved in the Caribbean. This had social as well as economic consequences. Sugar production and refining was extremely labor-intensive and required a type of organization similar to the industrial factories that will come in the next period. Labor demands could not be met by the local population after the Great Dying, so slaves were imported from Africa. Sugar was consumed by a mass market overseas, making the plantation complex an important development in world history. The social hierarchy in Brazil was very similar to the one developed in the Spanish colonies, but with one significant difference. These colonies maintained large populations that were born in Africa and only recently enslaved. Indeed, some 80% of the Africans taken during this period went to sugar plantations. Brazil also had a large population of mixed-race individuals between Spanish and African lineages, known as mulattoes. They also had numerous categories of mixed races within differing levels of social status. Since Spain and Portugal were wealthier and seized more colonies first, the British were left with the dregs of America. Compared to Latin America, New England seemed agriculturally underproductive and lacked wealthy mines. Consequently, a different kind of society developed in North America. British society was changing at the time, with intense disputes between kings and nobles, civil war, and a rising merchant class. Catholic-Protestant conflicts encouraged large numbers of dissenting religious groups to leave for the freedom of the colonies. Whole communities of people would be transplanted instantaneously. In the New England colonies, the settlers established family-run small farms, unlike the hereditary land estates of Old England and the large haciendas and plantations to the south. While the intense social stratification of Europe was not important to England, the conservative Protestant communities were extremely patriarchal and restricted women's rights. These were colonies of settlement with few surviving indigenous people and initially few African slaves. As British women came in large numbers, the white population was self-replicating and there was little mixing of the races. There were no social categories for those of mixed blood as in Latin America, only a strict hierarchy of races, white, red, and black. Unlike the Catholic colonies to the south, the Protestants had much less interest in converting the native people, but they did encourage literacy amongst themselves. Also, in contrast to the Spanish colonies, there was no strong royal bureaucracy. Rather, there were trading companies, wealthy sponsors, and self-governing communities. So, for the bulk of this chapter, then, Strayer is focusing on Europeans in America as a new feature in world history. But there's another new empire, and that is in Russia. Even as the American colonies represent a new kind of empire, a more traditional empire, even if new, emerged in Russia. After the decline of the Mongols, an independent Russian state developed based out of the city of Moscow. Over 3 centuries, its growth would make it as much an Asian empire as it was European. But why? What motivated this relatively small state to expand its territory all the way to the Pacific Ocean? The initial impulse to expand eastward was to conquer the neighboring warrior nomads of Central Asia who continued to periodically raid the cities of this nascent empire. From the perspective of the Russian state, the initial motive for expansion was security. The expansion into Siberia, however, was fueled by a desire to get access to soft gold, the furs that became a major export, providing wealth for the Russian state. The idea of spreading Christianity and civilization was really more of a justification than a motivation, as is frequently the case. So how did this expansion look from the perspective of those people who were conquered? The Russians had acquired gunpowder technologies and used them to great effect against the pastoralists whom they conquered. After the Russian state used its military might to conquer an area, the local population would be forced to pay yasak, the Russian word for tribute. But the Russians didn't just control the local pastoralists from a distance. Instead, they sent enormous numbers of settlers to colonize this new frontier, thus disrupting the pastoralists' way of life. While the settlers brought some forms of agriculture with them, notably the potato, the steppes in Siberia were not well suited for it. Thus, both the indigenous population and the new settlers became dependent on Russian merchants for alcohol, sugar, grain, and other imports from the homeland. The settlers also brought with them their language, culture, and religion, Orthodox Christianity. Over time, these replaced the languages and belief systems of the indigenous peoples. Because the indigenous peoples of Siberia had had little contact with others, they had no immunity to the microbes that the Russian settlers brought with them, and so it had a similar effect in Siberia as it had in the Americas. How was this dramatic expansion experienced by the Russians themselves, though? By conquering a variety of peoples in the west, south, and east, Russia had numerous different ethnicities and religions in its territory. Perhaps as a response to their shrinking relative size within the empire, ethnic Russians assumed an air of superiority over other ethnic groups. The Russian Empire amassed a great deal of wealth from furs and agricultural produce. This gave them the means to trade with Asia. What's more, because they were as much an Asian empire as a European one, they had direct contact with China. In the west, Russia competed with other states and empires and annexed lands as far west as Poland in the south, as far west as Poland and in the south parts of the Ottoman Empire. Despite numerous victories, the contact with the west showed some of Russia's backwardness. Tsar Peter the Great decided that he had to reform Russia and pull it into the future by a process of westernization, including shaving beards and building ships in the Baltic. While not an overseas empire like Spain, Portugal, or Britain, Russia had a massive collection of territories by annexing its neighbors. Because it was done by force, it required Russia to be fairly authoritarian in its state system. This can be seen in the title of the Russian autocrat, Tsar, which is the Russian word for Caesar. In this map of Russia, you can see over time the expansion eastward. The areas that are the first sort of expansion, the green in that sort of orangey color, again, from the Russian perspective, was mostly for security reasons. The expansion into Siberia, more for economic reasons. The brown areas added later on are part of its move into Europe. In this section, Strayer then examines the empires of Asia. These are empires that have existed in places that have seen civilization and empire for a long period of time already. China in particular, and also the so-called gunpowder empires of Mughal India and Ottoman Turkey. We'll also be looking at the Safavid Persians. Unlike the global empires of Europe, however, the Asian empires were more regional in nature. For most of its history, Chinese emperors preferred to let the world come to them instead of venturing out into new markets. The voyages of Zheng He were a notable, if brief, exception. Even as China would expand its territories dramatically toward the end of the period, it did so primarily for security reasons, not economic ones. While Strayer focuses on the newness of this period, it's important to remember that for most of the late agrarian, early modern period, the Ming Dynasty held power in China. This is not in this particular chapter, but as you may recall, the Ming set out to re-Sinify itself after the rule of the Mongols. Moreover, the Ming had decided to withdraw its maritime explorations in order to mobilize resources to defend itself against incursions from Central Asia. The Ming would be replaced by the Qing, a foreign Manchu regime headed by conquerors from the north. While they were resented by many ethnic Chinese, they did claim the mandate of heaven and used Confucianism to administer their rule. For security purposes, they engaged in an 8-decade campaign in Tibet, Xinjiang, and Mongolia, expanding their territory further westward than any previous dynasty. Was this colonial expansion? In many ways, it was comparable to European overseas colonial rule, as an ethnically distinct group conquered another group at a great distance. However, the empire was built for security purposes and not economic goals or settlement. Indeed, few ethnic Chinese ventured into the Wild West, and these regions maintained their traditional culture and lifestyle. As the Qing expanded west and Russia expanded east, Central Asia, once home to the nomadic pastoralists and the cosmopolitan merchant cities of the Silk Roads, soon found itself to be a neglected backwater on the periphery of two great landed empires. The rise in maritime trade only made matters worse. In this map of the Qing dynasty, the Qing rulers are from Manchuria. They are Manchus, which is just north of Korea, not ethnically Chinese. Again, they do use the Chinese system to rule, but you can see the darker purple area is what they start with, and their expansion westward over time to the left. As you may recall from chapter 12, in India the Delhi Sultanate was replaced by the Mughal Empire, who claimed descent from the Turkic and Mongolian peoples of Central Asia. Like its predecessors, the Mughal Sultan's greatest challenge was managing the incredible religious diversity within South Asia. Only the ruling dynasty and about 20% of the population were Muslim, while most of the population continued to follow some form of Hinduism. Moreover, during this period, Sikhism, a blending of Muslim and Hindu beliefs and practices, gained popularity. Sultan Akbar recognized the diversity of his realm and made many accommodations for it. While he did disapprove of sati and other religious restrictions on women, his rule was a time of great tolerance. He removed the jizya tax on non-Muslims and sponsored a house of worship where issues of faith could be debated among scholars of all religions. He sponsored a culture that fused a variety of traditions. Not everyone approved of Akbar's tolerance, though. Sirhindi was a Muslim reformer who attacked Sufism and the intrusion of Hindu practices and holidays into the Muslim community. He was among several scholars throughout Dar al-Islam who argued for a purified kind of Islam. We will examine the rise of Islamic fundamentalism more in chapter 15. Sultan Aurangzeb overturned many of Akbar's tolerant policies, reimposed the jizya, destroyed Hindu temples, banned dancing girls, and prohibited music at court. His reign marked a downturn in Hindu-Muslim relations and provoked bitter reactions from many Hindus and Sikhs that would weaken but not topple the empire. In this map of the Mughal Empire, Akbar set out to try to conquer all of India, which, as we know, had never really been done before. And if you look at the map, you'll see again, just like all of the previous empires, southern India does not actually come under control. One of the factors for this in this particular period, though, is a rising European presence in this particular area. After the Ottomans of Anatolia conquered Constantinople in 1453, they began expanding their territory throughout the Mediterranean and Middle East. While the majority of the Ottoman population was Muslim, there were significant Christian and even Jewish communities within its empire. The Ottoman rulers became the most powerful leaders in the Islamic world and combined absolute political, military, and religious authority. Curiously, even though the empire was run as a caliphate, the leaders preferred the Turkish title Sultan over the Arab title Caliph. While many Turkic women lost their pastoral freedoms as the Ottomans converted to Islam and became urbanized, Ottoman law gave them many rights and protections. Within the Sultan's court, elite women had a great deal of influence on their men. The rise of the Ottoman Empire as the most powerful Islamic state and its control of the holy cities of Mecca and Medina, and as well as Jerusalem, made Turks prominent people in the Islamic world. Moreover, their military technologies and techniques served as a model for other gunpowder empires in the Muslim world. While the conquest of Anatolia and Constantinople had eliminated the majority of the Christian population, there were many surviving communities in the Balkans where few Turks settled. They negotiated arrangements with the Turks. Many Jews also found a place within the relatively tolerant empire. The Ottomans developed a unique system to manage the Christian communities. The devshirme was a special tax on Balkan Christians whereby they had to turn over their firstborn sons to be converted to Islam and raised by the state. They would be educated to be administrators or trained to be janissaries, the elite fighting force. Thus, they could achieve high social status that might benefit their families. While the Ottomans were tolerant of Christians within their realm, they launched a series of wars on Christian Europe. While Europe feared the Great Turk, they also admired the power and culture of the empire. In this map of the Ottoman Empire, you can see just south of Constantinople the original territory of the Ottomans in Anatolia. Once they successfully topple Constantinople and the Byzantine Empire, their empire quickly grows, and in many ways they think of themselves as a kind of new Rome, and if you look at the territory that they occupy, it's not hard to see why. In between the Ottomans and the Mughals rose the Safavids in Persia. While the Safavids were a Muslim gunpowder empire, they were unique compared to their neighbors. Strayer mentions the Safavids in chapter 12, but he does not talk about them in this particular chapter. We're going to look at them in relation particularly to the Mughals and the Ottomans in class, so I do want to make a couple of notes at this point about them. Whereas the Ottomans and the Mughals displayed some degree of religious tolerance, the Safavids strictly enforced Shia Islam as the official religion. As we'll see in class, this had social, political, and cultural consequences. The religious differences led to repeated military conflicts between the Shia Safavids and their Sunni neighbors, but more so with the Ottomans than the Mughals. Even so, Persian culture, especially poetry and painting, were highly valued by the Sunnis. This map actually comes from the previous chapter, but just to sort of give you a sense of where these three so-called gunpowder empires, the Ottomans, the Safavids, and the Mughals, lie in relation to each other, is also worth remembering, too, that in West Africa during this period we have the Songhai Empire, and if you look at the purple area, that's Dar al-Islam in 1500. It's this time Srivijaya in Southeast Asia is still under Muslim control, although that will change once the Europeans get there and start colonizing. So that's this chapter. Please remember that the main idea question is looking at European empires in the Americas compared to the other ones. I want to thank you for joining me, and I'll see you in class.